I think Grenfell was a really good example of this, tragic, obviously there it was, but the response when some people suggested that some empty properties in the Kensington area, one of the wealthiest places, not just in London, but actually in the world, could be requisitioned to house the victims of the Grenfell tragedy. And what we saw play out here was the kind of classic response that you get here in the UK from people who say this is, outrageous. Property rights are sacrosanct, and any intervention in property rights would be kind of Soviet-style, communism, and we just need to stop this at any cost. And what this overlooks on the first instance is that when it comes to property and property rights, there's always and everywhere state intervention. Property rights, by their nature, are legal constructs. They are the right for some people to exclude people from that space. And that will then be defended through the state, through the courts. So if I walk into somebody's house in Kensington, they can phone the police and they'll remove me. And that's state intervention. That's the state intervening to protect private property rights. And then, so regardless of whether you're doing compulsory purchase or whether you're protecting the existing scenario, there's always state intervention. And then some people say, well, actually, this is contravening human rights, because if you look at the UN Declaration of Human Rights, there's a right to property ownership. And it does say that, but what the UN Declaration of Human Rights also says is that everyone has a right of access to housing. And so what we're talking about here is whose interests should the government intervene to protect? Is it the rights of the absentee landowners to exclude others from their property and for their human rights to property? Or are you protecting the rights of Grenfell victims who have a human right to housing? And are you going to do that through requisitioning, or perhaps on a temporary basis? And so the question that the government is faced is, whose interests am I going to intervene on behalf? And this is really about class. And in the scenario that we had after Grenfell, it was clear whose side the government was on, and that was of the absentee landowners over the victims of Grenfell. And I think this really just illustrates this attitude towards property that prevails in this country, which is that it's this kind of absolute right that is sacrosanct. And it's never been the case. Property rights have always been a kind of layer of rights, of different layers of access to use. They've never been absolute, and compulsory purchase has been an essential part of development in this country and many others, and without which we wouldn't have things like the railways, because landowners don't want to sell land. We wouldn't have had things like plenty of towns over the country which were built on this basis. And that the compulsory purchase was introduced because there was a recognition that there is absolutely a public interest case for intervening in property rights, where the public interest is strong, whether that's because we want a railway that benefits everyone, whether that's because we've had a tragedy at Grenfell. There's absolutely a public interest case to be had there. And yet the idea in Britain is that, property rights cannot be touched and are just inviolable, and it's just not true. Deregulation, as part of a wider ideology that started to come to the fore again in sort of 1970s and 1980s, which is really about markets know best, which is that any meddling or government sort of intervening in the market is necessarily a bad thing. And we had deregulation, as I mentioned already, in the financial sector, which was actually, we'll just let the banks do, whatever they want because they'll be able to decide. And that will somehow produce the most optimal outcome. We've also had, particularly more recently, significant deregulation across a whole range of things. We've had a mad system, which not many people are aware of, that our government introduced, which is 1 in, 3 out, which is if you want to bring in a new regulation, you have to do away with 3 others, regardless of the consequences, whether that's social, environmental, or whatever. And the result of this, in general, is putting the interests of the market first, which, as we know, drives a wedge through society and often just emphasises inequalities. And I think Grenfell, for me, really crystallised so many of the issues that are wrong in our society and our economy. You have this place which is in the wealthiest part of the world, with people living in conditions which are, not habitable, not safe, as a result of huge deregulation and which they've suffered from. Meanwhile, the people just across the road, who are the ones who have benefited from this system, who are living in multi-million-pound properties, who are, often making more from owning them, often not living in them, and not doing anything with them. And so I think this really crystallised the issue clearly, and I think it's really had a catalysing effect in people's minds that something's really wrong here and we really need to change. So the positive feedback loop is the relationship between the banking sector in the UK and the supply of housing and land. So when you're looking at the price of any good, you look at the supply of it and how that interlinks with demand for it. And in the UK, when it comes to housing, the supply of land is inherently fixed. We can't make any more of it. And on top of that, the supply of housing has been pretty static as well for a whole host of reasons over the past 4 decades. We've just not built enough houses. And when you look at demand side, the amount of money that people have to buy property is two things. It's one, the amount of income that they have, the amount of savings that they have, but it's also the amount that they can borrow from banks in order to purchase property. And about 4 decades ago, the amount that people could borrow was limited quite strictly by regulations, and it was mainly building societies that did lending. It was very kind of conservative lending from building societies. Beginning about the 1970s, though, there was quite significant deregulation in the financial sector, and banks were incentivized to come in to the mortgage lending market. And what you had there was an unleashing of a flood of new credit into the housing market, into the financing of new property. And what that did, when you have a flood of new money interacting with something where the supply is relatively fixed, you inevitably have inflation, house price inflation. And what that does is create a feedback loop between increasing house prices. That means that people then need to take out higher mortgages to buy more property in the first place. And this obviously benefits the banks because they make their money from interest. And that means that people have more household debt, and that means that house prices go up further, and then you have this continuous feedback cycle between ever-increasing house prices, ever-increasing levels of mortgage lending, and ever-increasing levels of household debt. And you're in a position today where we now have average house prices being about 9 times that of average incomes across the UK and up to 20 times higher here in London. And you have a situation where household debt is extremely high and a banking sector that's extremely profitable. And that's really where the kind of unholy alliance that's emerged between, on the one hand, banks and the other hand, existing property and landowners who have an interest in keeping this show on the road because it benefits them. I think think tanks have played a huge role, and not only today, but for the past sort of 4 or 5 decades, the kind of much of the problems that we have today in many ways stem from changes that have happened sort of 3-4 decades ago under the sort of the Thatcher era. And that whole process was really driven heavily by think tanks, by the neoliberal think tanks. So the Adam Smith Institute, the Institute of Economic Affairs, incidentally, they're also the ones who continue to refuse to say where their funding comes from. And today you have, whenever an issue comes up, and particularly in housing, but also other issues, whether that's corporation tax or whether that's regulation, very quickly they'll be on TV to defend a position which says, anything which sort of threatens business is bad. And this has they're very good at what they do. They're very strategic and they're very good at getting in the media. And of course, you've got a media landscape, a newspaper landscape, and a media landscape who are very keen to get these kind of voices on TV and in the papers to put these views across. But ultimately, from my point of view, these kind of think tanks are more or less corporate lobbyists. They don't say where the money comes from. It comes predominantly from big business. And so if they're refusing to say where it comes from, then I think they should be regarded as corporate lobbyists. Now, that's not to say that there's not think tanks that are doing good work. I mean, there's lots of think tanks out there who are doing good, honest work. And indeed, glad to see that on the housing issue, it's something where there has been good work done, over the years. But it comes down to influence, and it comes down to which voices are being listened to by the powers that matter, whether that's the media or whether that's the politicians. And unfortunately, today and in times gone by, it's been the think tanks, supposed think tanks, who don't say where the money comes from, who are putting across views, often without much evidence, as to sort of kind of protect the status quo, who are the ones who are getting in the media, who are the ones who are getting listened to by government. And I think that really needs to change. And I think a simple way to do that would just be to say everyone needs to be transparent about where their funding comes from, if you want to be called a think tank. otherwise you get called a corporate lobbyist.